hopefully today I can give you an overview of the over 105-year history of what Swanton Pacific Railroad holds. So let's start off with the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition. This was in 1915. It occurred in San Francisco, obviously. It was to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, but also to celebrate the rebuilding of San Francisco. So in 1906, San Francisco was substantially destroyed by earthquake and fire. And so by 1915, they were ready to kind of show off the fact that they were back. And with the Panama Canal opening, the West Coast ports were trying to position themselves to be the center for commerce for shipping on the West Coast. And so it was quite an affair. It was built out in the what is now the Marina District of San Francisco. It was interesting. It was constructed from temporary materials. It was not intended to be a permanent facility. There's only a few structures, a couple structures that still exist. The Palace of Fine Arts is one of them, but it was rebuilt essentially to make it a more permanent facility. So as part of the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition, there was something called the Overfair Railroad. And let me just play this YouTube video for you really quick here. This is, we're just going to play.
We're not seeing the video part of it. We can hear it.
It's on my screen. Can we see it now?
No, now we're back to the slide.
Okay. All right. It has something to do with okay. Again, just the music, or do you see the image?
Just the music right now.
All right, we're going to skip this part. Let's go back to the slides. So that video was, if you go to that YouTube link that I have on the screen, that video shows the Overfair Railroad and the locomotives that were involved. So the Overfair Railroad, or railway, was the vision of a gentleman named Lewis McDermott. McDermott was from a wealthy Oakland family, and he was kind of an entrepreneur and engineering buff, and he successfully acquired the transportation, one of the transportation concessions for the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition. So his idea was to build a 1/3 scale steam-driven railroad that would carry the people around the fairgrounds to be able to get to the various events. The fair site was 635 acres, so there was a lot of ground to cover. So McDermott decided to build 1/3 scale 462 Pacific type locomotive. Now he chose those because they were kind of the state-of-the-art steam locomotive at the time. And so he ended up building 4 of the Pacifics, and then he also built a switcher locomotive that he used as in the construction, and in some cases used as part of the transportation. If you want a more detailed sort of description of the Overfair Railroad, the San Francisco Museum has a very good article about the Overfair Railroad and how it was developed. So So basically, McDermott set out in some shops in Oakland to build these locomotives, and he did a very good job. They're very much to scale, with some few exceptions like the steam-driven air compressors and some other things that he adapted off of full-size railroads. Let's stay with this. So he was able to complete 3 of the 4 Pacific-type locomotives, the 462s. A 4th one was nearly completed, but had never had fire put in the boiler. The other 3 were used actively at the fair along with that switcher locomotive. As I said, the fair ran for about 9 months. I think McDermott had hoped it was going to go longer. It didn't. He ended up losing a tremendous amount of money in this. It's family money that he lost because they just, the ridership was not what they expected. And then the length of the time of the fair and the cost of building the locomotives and building out the railroad there on the fairgrounds. So after the fair was over, the locomotives and the rail cars were all returned to Oakland, and they languished on the property in Oakland. The locomotives were actually cared for pretty well, but the rail cars, all the passenger cars, were just stored outside, and weather took a really heavy toll on those. There was some hope that McDermott would be able to bring the locomotives and the railroad, the passenger cars to the World's Fair that happened on Treasure Island. That didn't become reality. However, in 1940, McDermott struck a deal with the then Oakland Zoo, what's now Nolan Park, to run the railroad there. They actually called it the Mountain Lion Railroad. But apparently by this time, McDermott was getting a little eccentric, a little cranky, I guess, and the zoo eventually invited him out. So the equipment was taken down, the railroad was dismantled. In the meantime, in 1943, Billy Jones was able to acquire the passenger cars. And these were in a fairly, and let me back up a second. Billy Jones was a former Southern Pacific engineer who had started to build out essentially about a 1/3 scale railroad in the San Jose area. It still exists, and you can still go ride the Billy Jones Wildcat Railroad. So Billy Jones bought up some of the cars, the railroad, the passenger cars. And then in 1948, he acquired the locomotives from the McDermott estate after Lewis McDermott passed away. And so those locomotives were stored in the East Bay in the San Jose area under Billy Jones' care. But they were not brought back into service, as I understand it. And then they started getting some attention later. So in 1960, the 1914, the 1915, and the 1500, which was that little switcher engine, they were sold to some folks down in Southern California. And in 1975, the 1912 and 1913 were used up in the Calistoga area to create a steam railroad associated with a vineyard in Calistoga. So actually the 1913 went back into service and was operated at that site. The railroad only lasted a couple of years. It was not a great location, so there wasn't very much, there wasn't enough visitors to make it really pay off. And so it wasn't long before the railroad there at Calistoga was decommissioned. It was in 1979 that Al Smith learned of the locomotives and purchased the 1912 and the 1913 from the folks up at Calistoga. And then once he got a hold of those, he started, sort of looking around for the rest of them. And in 1983, he was able to purchase the 1914 and the 1915. And so that was the beginning. In 1979 was the beginning of the Swanton Pacific Railroad. So before we talk too much about the Swanton Pacific Railroad, we ought to talk a little bit about Al Smith. So Al Smith grew up in the East Bay in the San Jose area. His father was a farmer, orchardist. They had orchards that the Southern Pacific tracks ran through. So as he grew up, he was surrounded by these huge steam locomotives and just completely captivated by those trains. As he got older and decided it was time to go to college, he actually went to Cal Poly, and he told me one time the reason he came to Cal Poly was that he found out that the campus had a train that ran through campus. And that's true. The Southern Pacific runs through the Cal Poly campus on its way into San Luis Obispo. And he claims that's why he decided to go to Cal Poly. So he was a crop science student at Cal Poly. And then at the beginning of World War II, Al went to work for the Southern Pacific Railroad. So he left Cal Poly, went to work for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And, my guess is he probably would have stayed with the railroad, except he was involved in an accident. My understanding is he was blown off of a freight car by a blast of steam, and he ended up losing part of his leg. And so he was basically was not able to continue with the Southern Pacific. They provided some kind of compensation for the accident, and he actually went back to Cal Poly, finished his degree, and got his teaching credential and started teaching agriculture, initially over in the San Joaquin Valley, but eventually he got back to the East Bay of and was teaching agriculture. In addition to running the orchard, his father was also the general manager of a small grower co-op that was set up for all of the growers in the East Bay to be able to get, supplies and materials at reduced cost because of the size of the buying power of the co-op. And when Al Smith's father passed away, the board approached Al Smith about taking over as the general manager of this grower co-op. So Al was one of those guys that just, could see things a little more clearly, perhaps, than some of us. And he realized at the time that San Jose and the Bay Area didn't need a grower cooperative. They needed some kind of a hardware store to basically meet the needs of all these new homeowners and all these neighborhoods, these residential neighborhoods that were going in up and down the bay. So he eventually was able to shift the focus of this small grower co-op and turned it into Orchard Supply Hardware. And he obviously did very well with that, and that was in large part where the funds came from that allowed him to be able to do what he's done with the ranch and the railroad. Now, I told you that when he had his accident with the Southern Pacific, there was a settlement. And with that settlement, Al Smith bought some property near Davenport along Swanton Road. And the significance of this property to Al Smith was it was originally a Boy Scout camp that he had attended when he was a young boy. And I remember sitting and talking to Al, looking at some old pictures of some of the old trestles that were built when that area was clear cut after the 1906 earthquake. So that whole area along 101 north of Santa Cruz was clear cut to rebuild San Francisco. And they built these wooden trestles in the canyons to be able to bring the lumber out from these the higher elevations. And he talks about going up these canyons when he was a Boy Scout, and a group of them would go out and get on these old trestles. And by this time, the trestles were pretty rickety. And then they would start to rock back and forth on the trestle. And the deal was the last guy standing was the bravest, right? Everybody else would eventually panic and go down and just sort of grab on and hold on and hope the trestle didn't collapse. And he had some pictures of these old trestles, and I could just imagine this group of kids out there on these trestles doing this kind of stuff. So that was the beginning of Swanton Pacific Ranch, was that initial purchase. And over time, Al Smith accumulated neighboring properties and ended up with 3,200 acres, 3,200 acres. They literally went from the coastline. They had almost 6 miles of coastal frontage. Went from the coast up into basically old growth redwood at the top of the ridge. And absolutely beautiful piece of property that he eventually gathered together. So, as I said, in 1979, he decided to start putting together the Swanton Pacific Railroad. And so it's interesting. The logo is basically a Southern Pacific logo with the S laid on its side. So it's the lazy SP is the term he used to describe his railroad. And Al Smith, along with a group of mostly railroad retirees, began to build out this railroad. And they started operating these steam locomotives, so the 1912, the 1913, and 1914. I told you the 1915 had been finished for the, almost finished, but there was never a fire in the boiler. And so it was in his roundhouse basically apart. And he made the decision to donate that, the 1915, to the California State Railroad Museum in Sacramento. And so until recently, if you went into the Railroad Museum in the lobby, the 1915 was on display there. And it was beautifully restored, but it's never been operated. So it's never been a working steam locomotive. My understanding is they're doing a remodel on the Railroad Museum, and the 1915 has been moved out of that area while the remodel takes place. And I'm not exactly sure how they plan to put that back together. So back to Al Smith. In the late 1980s, Al approached Cal Poly with the idea of donating the Swanton Pacific Ranch to Cal Poly. And at that time, I was working as the interim associate dean in the College of Agriculture at Cal Poly, and was tasked to work with Al to help facilitate the process for us to explore the idea of taking over the ranch. So Al's idea was that the ranch would be a working laboratory where students of agriculture, whether it would be students that are studying natural resources, animal science, crop science, soil science, you name it, would have a working laboratory that they could come and deepen their education. The idea was that it was to be kept as a single piece, the property was to be kept as a single piece of property. It wasn't to be split up and sold off. And so we were able to work through that process. Now, in those early days, in the late 80s, when we were working with Al Smith, his plan was different for a railroad. His plan was to create a separate railroad organization, a 501c3, that would basically take over the operation of the Swanton Pacific Railroad. As time progressed, he became concerned that the people that would be the likely suspects to be part of this organization that was going to be created for the railroad were aging out and passing away, and he was concerned about the sustainability of his plan. And so he came back to Cal Poly and basically asked that the railroad be folded into the land gift. And so it was in 1993, I believe, that the gift was actually made, where the ranch, the 3,200 acres, and the railroad were gifted to Cal Poly. And at that time, the College of Agriculture, what's now the College of Agriculture, Food, and Environmental Sciences, was charged with operating the ranch and operating the railroad. Now, you kind of scratch your head and say, College of Agriculture operating a railroad doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, the good news is there was a core of people that created what has been termed as the Swanton Pacific Railroad Society. We'll talk about them in a minute, but they're the ones that really have kept the train going. So let's talk a little bit about what equipment that Al Smith accumulated before he made the gift. So there's more than a mile of track. The track follows the Scotts Creek drainage, or Scotts Creek, down from what used to be the town of Swanton, and then heads down toward the ocean. And this is the right-of-way crosses the creek and then parallels the creek as it goes down to an open meadow at the end. So at the end of the mile or so of track, Al built a Y to be able to turn the locomotives around. And at the top end, there's a turntable that was basically purchased from the folks up at Calistoga, where it was originally put into service. So again, I mentioned that Al was able to get the 4 steam locomotives. So there's 3 of the Pacific locomotives, and the 4th steam locomotive is the 1500, the switcher. When I talk about a switcher, that 1500, instead of towing a tender, has saddle tanks. And so on one side, those locomotives were originally designed to run on coal, so one side is a coal hopper and the other side is a water tank. Those locomotives have been converted to run on oil, so since the Calistoga days, they've been oil-fired steam locomotives. So the 1500 hasn't run in a very long time. It's apart and needs to be restored. The other locomotive that Al Smith acquired was a 1/3 scale GE U-25 diesel switcher locomotive, and that one is used for sort of day-to-day track maintenance, moving cars around, that sort of thing. We also had a small motor car. Randy Jones is a key player in that. That was a car that he helped build, or he built, and we used that to again move things around, particularly around the railroad yard. Over time, Al had acquired about 9 passenger cars. There was only one of the original overfare passenger cars that still existed, and that one had just recently been restored, but had yet to be used. The railroad also has a number of maintenance away cars. Some of those were actually built at Cal Poly. There's a really cool crane that we have, a crane car with a motorized crane that we can take up and down the track. There's hopper cars, flatbed maintenance cars, so crew cars, other things that are used to maintain the tracks and the railroad facilities. More recently, the students at Cal Poly built what we call our heavy haul car, and it's a rail car that's designed to come apart with hydraulics to let you lower the deck down so you can drive a piece of equipment up onto the deck, use the hydraulics to lift that deck up, bring your truck back under it, put it down, now you can roll it down the track. There's areas in the railroad that are essentially not accessible other than by the railroad. And so we had to have a way to haul equipment down if we needed to do some construction work or other things. And so that was a completely student project, a beautiful car, a good outcome for that effort. And so Cal Poly has made an effort to engage students in the railroad. We've had a number of student-related railroad projects. We have a track sweeper device that was built by students. More recently, the students did some stuff with using computerized and GPS technology to be able to monitor where locomotives, where trains are along the track. We also had students build a really nice track gauge sensor where we could roll that down the track and it measures the gauge, but it also puts pressure on the track to see if the ties are holding the tracks the way they should. And it's all done electronically with the data loggers so we can look foot by foot and see what the condition of the track is. So in terms of being able to ensure track safety, that was a huge advantage to us. So the facilities that Al Smith put together were allowed us to basically operate and maintain the railroad. So you had the roundhouse. So on this slide on your computer screen, it's in the upper left-hand corner, is the roundhouse where we'd store the locomotives. Upper right is the car shop and the car barn that's sort of tucked in behind it. So that's where we were able to roll cars in and out to do maintenance. And the picture at the bottom is our machine shop. Now it's kind of interesting, the machine shop is actually the old cafeteria from the Boy Scout camp. So when Al Smith was a young boy coming up to the Boy Scout camp, this is where they would come to get their food when they were at the Boy Scout camp. And if you go to the back wall, the outside back wall of this building, you can see where the Boy Scout kids wrote their names and drew little pictures and sort of an early form of graffiti, right, from the Boy Scouts, as they waited in line to go through the cafeteria for their meals. And so the building has quite a bit of history. It's kind of cramped, but the volunteers have done a good job equipping the machine shop and are able to do most of our own repairs with the equipment we have in place. Also, the railroad has an open-air train station, and it has 4 standard gauge cabooses that were acquired over a period of time. One of the cabooses is actually Al Smith's office from his days at Orchard Supply Hardware, and it's labeled, it has the Orchard Supply, the OSH symbol on the side, and he had used it as an office, and so there's some history there. The other cabooses are essentially Southern Pacific cabooses that have been acquired over time. So the operations of the Swanton Pacific Railroad is pretty limited, actually, because the railroad's not it's not permitted to operate like a public venue in a sense. So It's operated primarily by the Swanton Pacific Railroad Society. We typically have 3 or 4 public events a year. Those that are familiar with it would recognize that we had what was called Al Smith Day. That's usually in the spring around Al Smith's birthday. And, you know, we would attract, well, we could attract as many people as we wanted. We typically capped the attendance of those events to 500 people because it just became difficult to find parking spaces and to be able to manage that many people to make sure everybody kind of went away happy having rides. So the society basically would prepare for and operate the locomotives on those events. We'd also have what was called Cal Poly Day. Al Smith created a tradition of on New Year's Eve taking the last train out and the first train in. So just before midnight, you would ride the train out of the station, go down to the end of the track, they'd turn around, and just after midnight, you'd roll back into the station. And they would have a New Year's celebration kind of centered around the train. The volunteers are able to keep the railroad going through the use of what we call work weekends. And during the winter, it's 1 weekend a month. It's always associated with the second Saturday of the month. So whenever the second Saturday is, that weekend is the work weekend. In the late spring through the summer into early fall, they go to 2 weekends a month, the second and fourth Saturdays. And then usually in July or August, they will have a work week. They call it summer camp. And so volunteers will come and pretty much most of them stay there on site, and they work on major projects for the entire week. And it gives them plenty of time, and usually that culminates in running the steam locomotives. And in some cases, the last weekend or last Sunday of the summer camp was an open house that was primarily targeted to the volunteers, their families and friends, and it's sort of a thanks, you know, to everybody for letting the volunteers do what they do and come ride the train. And so there was a little bit of a dark history as part of this with the locomotives. Some of the neighbors didn't think as highly of the locomotives as Al Smith did, and so there were some battles, some culminating in some legal action. And so the county has been very clear that railroad operations will be limited, and so we have to kind of pay attention to those that decree from the county. And so the idea that we'd open this railroad up any time is just not in the cards. It's we have an agreement that limits the use of the railroad. But we welcome visitors, especially on the work weekends. We tell people, come on by. Somebody will show you around, let you get up close to the locomotives. Occasionally, if you're visiting on the right day or right time, you might actually get a ride on, one of the work cars or something like that. But the railroad is open to the public informally most of the year, and then with just a handful of formal public activities at other times. So again, I mentioned this group several times already, but the Pacific Coast Railroad Society is really the reason the railroad continues to exist. Without this group, I don't think the university would have been able to maintain the railroad, to be able to do the things that have been done with the railroad. And so any given work weekend, summer camp, there's always projects to be done. And the pictures to the left of your screen show all the different things going on. And I don't care what your what your skill set is. There's something for you to do. I mean, if all you can do is move a paintbrush, then that's your job. You know, that can be your job. You know, if you're an equipment operator, then okay, maybe you can operate the shovel and help us clear right away or do other things. You know, if you're a pipe fitter, man, we've got a lot of pipe fitting to do on these steam locomotives. You want to learn how to lay track? Come on out, laying track and replacing ties all the time. And so it's you know, there's more to be done than there are people or time to do it for the most part. But the university and the College of Agriculture owe a great gratitude to the Swanton Pacific Railroad Society for all they do to operate, to maintain and operate these locomotives. Just as a sidebar, in this picture to the left, the one on the bottom, that's actually the 1913 with the new boiler fitted to it. So these boilers on the steam locomotives were built in the obviously the early 1900s. They were all hand riveted. They were all built by hand with you know, with machine tools that don't, you know, that we think are almost prehistoric today. And so as those locomotives aged, one of the things that became a concern is what kind of pressure can they take. And so the decision was made in the case of the 1913 to go ahead and abandon the old boiler and have a new boiler built. So instead of being hand riveted, these new boilers, of course, are all welded. The advantage is we get a certified boiler. The old hand-built boilers could not be certified because they were built before the certification process existed. So the only way we could get them certified today is we'd have to dismantle the locomotive and then have an engineer come in and do X-ray and ultrasound work to determine the thickness of the metal and integrity of the rivets and come up with a engineering estimate on what the appropriate pressure rating would be. So we've decided in the case of two locomotives that we would just go ahead and get new boilers that are certified and sort of because the cost isn't much different. And we could go try to certify the old boilers and find out, spend a lot of money and find out that we can't certify them. So our decision was to go ahead with replacing the boilers. So as I said, the society benefits from a lot of hard-working volunteers, and the society offers a lot of opportunities for anybody that wanted to get involved with things that are railroad related. Now all this kind of came to a screeching end, or at least to a hard pause, on August 16th when the CZU complex fire in Santa Cruz County came down off of the mountain through the canyons and through the railroad yard. And when the fire subsided, we found the roundhouse, which this is the roundhouse with the locomotives inside, was completely destroyed. The car shop was destroyed. The car barn was destroyed. The turntable we used that's in front of the roundhouse was damaged, not significantly. It's been repaired. The machine shop, amazingly, sitting all in the sort of right in the same complex, was almost completely unaffected. There were some plastic window panes that show signs of heat damage, but for the most part, they were unaffected. Our four cabooses, the train station, and with some minor exceptions, the track was not damaged. So, but the devastation, as you can see from this picture, the heat of the fires were substantial. For example, if you look at the picture of the locomotive that's that's sitting there. You see where the toolbox is, and on top of the boiler, just to the right of the toolbox, there's a bracket sitting there. That bracket used to have the bell. So there was a brass bell on there, and the bell's gone. There's no evidence the bell existed. So that fire was hot enough to melt the bell. It melted the whistles. It was a very, very hot fire. So the devastation was just, mind-boggling, and it's just heartbreaking to see the kind of damage that's taken place. Now, there were a couple of bright spots. The 502 was actually in the machine shop, and as I mentioned, the machine shop was spared from the fire. So the 502 had been in for maintenance and some restoration work, and so with the exception of the hoods that go over the back of where the engine and other things are, the 502 can be brought back into service without too great of effort. The 1912, which is the steam locomotive that's stripped down, you see in the picture in the center top, that locomotive's in Wyoming having a new boiler fitted on it. Now, as the director of the railroad, I've been kind of hounding the company in Wyoming to finish the 1912. It's well overdue to be returned to the railroad. Had they met my requested deadlines, we would have lost that locomotive too. So because they have been slow to get this locomotive, or the new boiler put on this locomotive, we essentially have saved this locomotive. So they will hopefully have this locomotive completed and back on site by this summer. The train station, the bottom center photograph, untouched by the fire. The fire raged just above this area and around it, but for whatever reason never went through the meadow itself where the train station is. And as I said earlier, most of the track is serviceable. There are some areas where the ties were caught on fire and burned out from under the rails, but we'll be able to get back in and repair those without too much effort. So what's the future hold? People are asking that question a lot. What do the future hold for these for the Swanton Pacific Railroad? And so our first step is to recover the locomotives. And we've sort of had, we've covered the area. We've put a tent over the area to keep the weather from deteriorating the locomotives further. We've been told, we've been advised not to roll the locomotives with that kind of fire, with that kind of heat, that the kind of damage that occurs to the bearings, if we roll them, we can cause further damage. And so what we've done is we're going to go in starting actually on Monday and recover as many of the parts that were off of the locomotives as we can. And then the cleanup crews will come in and clean up all the fire-related debris. And after that, we'll be able to come in with and lift the locomotives and put them onto skids. So we won't roll them. We'll lift them, put them onto skids, and then slide the skids into storage containers and basically secure the locomotives until at such time we can start to work on restoration again. We're told that, of course, we'll have to have the boilers re-inspected. On the 1913, even though we'd only fired it once at a low pressure, we're going to have to basically take that locomotive apart again, have the boiler retested, and then recertified and put back into service. The motor car was in the barn as well, in the roundhouse. It's substantially destroyed. Whether we can salvage the frame and some other things, we'll look and see. But that, as I say, that work begins right away. The 502, we need to finish the work that we started on the 502. We need to get a tender restored that will then be used for the 1912 when it's returned from Wyoming. And so we'll assess the condition of the 3 tenders that were in the roundhouse and take one of those and rebuild it to be ready for the 1912. As I said, we'll have to rebuild the motor car. We'll have to build passenger cars. All of our passenger cars are destroyed. When the fire went through the car barn, it was hot enough that basically, and those cars are substantially wood, and so they're gone. We'll be able to recover the frames, the trucks, some of the other things, but essentially we're starting from scratch when it comes to rail cars. The other question we're going to have to ask is whether or not, since essentially we have to rebuild the entire railroad anyway in terms of the buildings, whether or not the current location is the best location. It kind of makes sense to stay there because of some of the infrastructure, but at the same time, we could move the railroad down toward the ranch headquarters, move it away from the creek, because the creek does present a risk to our right-of-way. We've had problems with washouts from the creek in the past. And so going in and looking at possible locations to resite the railroad is a possibility in the process. But the expectation is that, well, starting this month, hopefully, the university will begin a visioning process for the ranch and for the railroad. And it's happening for the ranch as well because the ranch really was shoehorned into what the existing facilities are. Since everything on the ranch was destroyed except for the ranch headquarters building, we really have a chance to redefine the facilities at the ranch as well as the railroad. So hopefully there will be an integrated vision of how the ranch and railroad will be rebuilt, and that'll come out in the next few months. But in the meantime, we're going to keep moving ahead with the 502, with the restoration of the timber, and to get the track ready to at least have some limited use of the locomotives in the near term. So those of you interested in more information about this, there's a variety of sites you can go to. There's a good Wikipedia page on the Pan-Pacific International Exhibition. The San Francisco Museum has good information about not only the exhibition, but also the Overfair Railroad. Of course, we have a Swanton Pacific page on Wikipedia. There's also Facebook pages, and Cal Poly has a website or homepage for the railroad itself. These links, don't worry about writing them down. These links will be available on the museum site, and if you watch this again later, you'll see that.